This screencast is perhaps going to be one of the most important screencasts as far as teaching you the basics of interfacing between Excel and VBA. I'm going to introduce you to objects, properties, and methods, the most common ones that we'll be working with in this course. So the range object, the selection property, the active cell, which is a property, the cells, offset, rows, columns, count, these are all properties that are tremendously useful. And then we have two methods, which are the select and activate. Let's start out with the range object. If you just want to refer to cell D22, you can use range D22 in quotations. If you want to refer to a range of cells, you can put A1 colon B5, for example. If you have a named cell, some of you might know that in Excel, you can click on a cell and then up here in the name box, you can type in a name for that cell. So now it's named pressure. You can refer to it in terms of range pressure. Range D colon D refers to the entire column D. You can also select multiple columns. Range 3 is the entire row 3. You can also use rows. There are other ways to identify range objects. One of the most common is the cells property. Cells by itself refers to all the cells on the spreadsheet. So cells 4, 5, remember it's always rows, then columns. That also corresponds to cell D5. There's an offset property. Got a couple examples of this in a few minutes. If we had a named cell named temperature, then range temperature.offset11, it uses temp as a base cell and move over one column and down one row. So let me show you a couple examples. We can use the select. We can select range A2 to C6. So if I run this range A2 to C6 select, you notice that it selects that region. This, by the way, is almost the same as range A2 to C6.activate. I'm going to show you the main difference between select and activate. Ranges can also have a range property. This, we're going to use range A2 to C6, but then we're taking range B2 of that range. So let me show you this. I'm just going to put that in a message box. So range A2 to C6 would be this region. Range B2 means range B2 of that range. So you can imagine the region I have selected here is its own new spreadsheet, and range B2 then of A2 to C6 would be that cell. So I can run this and it outputs -2. The selection property is also really useful. So we can refer to selection.cells32. Recall that cells refers to all the cells on the spreadsheet. So we can kind of do a sub-property of a property, which means that we are referring to cells row 3, column 2 of our selection. So in order to run this, I need to start with the selections, and then I'm going to do F8. We're going to message box selection.cells32. So of my selection, the third row and the second column. By the way, we don't have to use cells. You can always just use selection 3, 2. And in that case, if this is my selection, it's going to message box the third row and the second column. Next, we can always have a range property of the selection. So if I choose this as my selection, and just to reiterate, a range is a fixed range, but a selection can change every time you run the sub. So if I have a selection here and I run this, it's going to message box range B2. So this is range B2 of my selection, which again, you could imagine the selection being its own little spreadsheet, and we're looking at B2 of that selection, so that's 5. Next, we can use the method select. So what this is going to do is it's going to take range B2 to C3 of the selection, right? So this is like a sub-property of a property, and it's going to select that. So let me show you what this does. Now when I do this, whenever you have a method, it's not output, it's just you don't have an output to it. So I'm going to delete the message box there, and let's run this. So it's going to look at range B2 to C3 of the selection. So that would be cell C4 to D5. When we run that, it selects that region. So let me just real quick show you the difference between activate and select. So let me run the select first. So I've got my selection. Selection.cells 2 comma 3 would be cells row 2 column 3, so that's this 5, and then I'm going to select that. So look what happens when I run this. It selects that. So that's the new selection. But when I replace it with activate, starting with the same selection, but now when I run this, I'm going to activate that. So you see how I didn't change the selection like I did when this was a select, but instead I changed the active cell to C3, which is cells 2, 3 of the selection. Active cell is that single active cell that's kind of highlighted on the spreadsheet. And a lot of times we use this with the offset property, and this it's an output, so you need either to message box it or to assign it to a variable. If this is my active cell, this is going to message box whatever cell is one row, so plus one row and plus one column, and that'll be 10. So when we run this, it should display 10, which it does. I like to use the offset select. So what this does, and this is a method, so we're not outputting anything. What this does is it uses our active cell as a base. It offsets -4 rows. If I start with a -6, this is going to select the cell that's offset -4 rows, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 2 columns over. So it's going to go 1, 2. So it should give the 9. And it's going to select that. So we run that, and it selects the 9. We can also use the count property. We can count the number of cells in A1 to C3. This doesn't tell you how many cells have numbers in them. It just counts the number of cells. We can use the rows property along with the count properties. We could also do the same for columns. So here I've got it set up. I've dimmed 2 integers. Dim number of rows as integer and number of NC, number of columns as integer. NR then is your range dot rows dot count. So how many rows are in that range? Number of columns will give us the number of columns in range A1 to C5. Because it's not a selection, I can have my cursor anywhere, and we're going to go ahead and run this. And I haven't message boxed anything, so we'll just look down here in the locals window to make sure that those are working. And I'll bring this up. So number of rows is 5, and then I execute the next line, and we've counted the number of columns. Similarly, I can just change the range object to the selection property. This will depend upon your selection before running the sub every time. So let's just do an example here. I'm going to step through, and again, I don't have a message box, so we can look down here in the locals window. It counted 4 columns and 4 rows. These, because they're not methods, these are properties, they always output something. So you either need a message box or they need to be on the right side of an equality. You can't just write selection.count on its own, or it'll give you an error because this is returning a value. I wanted to show you something quite useful. If you don't know going into the sub what the row and the column are going to be, so the row number and the column letter, you can always obtain that from the user. So in this example, I'm dimming row index as an integer, but then call as a string because that's going to be a letter. Let's just put in row 3, click OK. It's going to ask us then for the letter. So let's just do C, and then that should be, so C3, it should be 5, and it message boxes that value. So that's how you can obtain from the user the row and column and do something with that.